Hello everyone, and welcome to another tutorial of MNPRX, and this time we're gonna take a closer look into the Frayed stylization. So I've noticed a lot that we've been talking about watercolor, we have tutorials on cutout, but Frayed has not been really taken care of and addressed in our tutorials. So this time we're only gonna talk about the Frayed stylization in MNPRX, so let's get started. So the Frayed stylization in MNPRX can be found here on once you go into software in our web page and you go into Frayed here, then you'll find all the different information about Frayed stylization. And apart from, seeing some examples, some projects where the Frayed stylization has been used for, you get also a breakdown over each of the individual global configuration attributes. Right, so for example, like inflation, frequency, this is all illustrated with video, so it's very easy to know, okay, what's gonna do what, even without having to play with a slider. So once we go a bit further down, we're gonna see something here called considerations, because the Frayed stylization doesn't work with all type of geometry, so it's important to read this before even considering this for your project. So the first things first, NURB surfaces. NURB surfaces are not supported by the Frayed stylization because they can't store vertex colors, which is what we use to do things with paint effects. So the other thing that might be a little bit tricky is that parenting of mesh objects is also not supported. So we're gonna be stylizing a scene where this happens, and well, I'm gonna explain this in further detail, but basically, whenever you're parenting two meshes together, just use the parent constraint instead and keep them in the same hierarchy, all right? This is because of how the underlying architecture of frayed edges works within Maya. And then frayed edges works with inflation, meaning that whatever you have in the scene, we render it again and we inflate it a bit. That's kind of the reason why NURB surfaces are also not supported. But yeah, this brings some caveats. So basically thin objects should have both sides faces. Otherwise, since we're inflating geometry, right, if it would only be a plane with the normals in this direction, right, we would only be shifting the plane, right? But if you have a leaf and only has one side, it's going to shift, but it's not really going to be inflated around it per se. And yeah, vertex normals in objects are not subdivided, will need to be averaged for hard-edged objects. Otherwise, each face vertex has its own normal, and inflation will leave gaps between each inflated face, created uncoherent frayed edges. And then, of course, there's sometimes some warnings that Maya gives you, but whenever you get this due to, like a warning due to multiple instance child, then you can just disable the frayed edges for a bit, do whatever change you need, and enable them back again, and everything will be back to normal. So with that being said, let's get started. So for this, we wanted to stylize this scene here by Glen Fox on Sketchfab and make it look something like this. And we're gonna do this from scratch so that we really go into, okay, this is the frayed edges workflow. By the way, this scene is gonna take a while, so if you wish, you can skip ahead. I'm gonna be adding some markers in timelines. So we're gonna go from preparing the scene to enabling the style to stylizing and art directing the style. So feel free to skip ahead. Let's get started. So now that we have added MNPRX materials to the entire scene, it's time for us to apply the style. So if we go here to the style tool, we can quickly double click on the frayed edges style to apply it to the scene. You can also choose other frayed edges styles, so you can go here to the filter and click on frayed. And we have actually from the previous stylization that I did of this scene, this Frayed Tokyo, which is a little bit different than the standard frayed stylization. Now, something that you will notice is that there's this weird kind of noise appearing on some objects, for example, also here on the wheels of the tram. And this is because of how the frayed edges are implemented in Maya. So in order to create frayed edges, we are creating instances of objects in the scene, of geometry in the scene. So as you can see here, we have our right foot geometry, and then we have our right foot geometry MNPRX instance. And we have to work with instances because some of these objects need to be rendered in one scene render pass and others in another scene render pass. And we do this like in real time on the fly. So all the instances get rendered in one pass, all the other ones in a different pass. Now the problem that we have is that this separation of instance and not instance doesn't work when shapes are parented to each other. For example, this one here is not an instance, so it renders everything that it contains into the normal pass, the normal scene render pass. So these instances, which should be rendered somewhere else, are instead rendered in the normal pass. And this is why you start seeing this noise here. And by the way, this noise is none other than the noise in charge of creating the frayed edge stylization. Let me go a little bit deeper there and explain how it works. So as I was telling you, the frayed edges relies on inflation. So whenever we change to the inflated noise target in the pass inspector, you're gonna see this noise. And this noise can be changed in terms of frequency, right? It can be very fine or very rough. It can be also changed in terms of amplitude, but we can only see this once we apply the frayed edges, not in this pass. And in terms of inflation, as you can see, we're inflating stuff here. 0.05 I think was default. If you don't have a default value and you know you worked with the default from here, you can just reload it, right? So the key thing about frayed edges is that these frayed edges need to look the same size no matter if you're far away or very close. And to achieve this, we use something that is called fractalization. So whenever you zoom in, you're gonna see that the noise keeps the same relative size to the image, right? When we zoom out, the noise keeps the relative size to the image. And this is what allows us to have consistent frayed edges no matter what the distance is, right? When we go very close, we have frayed edges. When we go very far, we have frayed edges. This can be accentuated by increasing the amplitude. So in here, whenever we zoom, we still have the same frayed edges that we have here. So fractalization is what allows these frayed edges to remain the same size no matter what distance we have from these objects. Now something else that you might notice is that the frayed edges on animated objects, they tend to float around, right? This is 3D noise after all. So if something moves in 3D, the noise is not necessarily going to move. So in order to enable that, we need to specify that the object itself is deformed. So I go into the material, into the settings, and I define this. Okay, this object here is deformed, so treat it as such. Once I enable that and I scrub, you're gonna see that the frayed edges, they stick to the objects. All right, so this doesn't matter if the camera is the one that's rotating around or zooming in somewhere out, the noise will stay, the frayed edges will stay the same. But whenever there's animation, like something moving in the scene, not being static, you need to define this in the material. And you do this by selecting the object, selecting its material, and setting it as deformed. Always remember, if you have multiple objects that are animated and you don't want to select every single material, you can also use the bulk attribute tool. So I could select everything and just go into the bulk attribute tool and then click here on deformed and tell Maya all of them are deformed, treat them like that. Now that we have the frayed edges stuck to the moving objects, we need to get rid of this kind of weird things that are like mixing in that we don't want. And the way we do that is by separating, by not having this object hierarchy. So let's work on that. First, I'm gonna save. And now something that I would recommend when doing this is to disable the frayed edges. And you can do this by clicking on the configuration node and then unticking here the enable attribute. So once we have that, we have, let's address the trees first. We see that the trees are bound to a locator, which in itself is a shape. So we need to address that. So we have 3 different leaves here. The good thing though is that these are not animated, so we could simply group them together and move it outside of the hierarchy. We can get rid of the locator and call these trees group. Because a group or a null is not a shape, it's not a problem. If it's parented to a locator, because the locator is considered a shape by Maya, it presents a problem. So keep that in mind. So we got rid of that. Just to verify, I'm gonna enable the frayed edges again, and we don't have any weird stuff happening here anymore. So I remove this again. Now it's a bit different in the case of the tram because the tram is animated. So if I look at the wheels, they are parented to the tram that is animated. So we need to keep this in the same way. So the way we do this is I'm gonna create a group. This is gonna be tram wheels group. I'm gonna unparent them, and then I'm gonna parent constrain them together as to keep the relationship that we removed through constraints. So we're going to go into rigging, constraint, and then parent. So once we have them parent constrained, the wheels are still going to move with the tram. So we rebuilt the previous hierarchy, the relationship that we had from the previous hierarchy through a parent constraint instead. And now when I enable the frayed edges, you will see that it's not a problem anymore. It's there. And we need to do this with the entire scene. So this is another example. These ones are placed on a wire that is being deformed as well. So as you can see, the wire is going left and right. So we need to do the exact same thing that we did with the wheels. We disable this. We select all of the lanterns. This is going to be lanterns group. And I parent constrain them so that they stay the same way that they used to be. And I can enable the frayed edges and there's no problem anymore. So of course, when you are creating assets for the frayed edges style, you already paid attention to this, so you don't need to do this. But in case you happen to open an asset and it has this issue, now you know how to solve it. There's one last object that I want to solve, is this guy here. And I disable frayed edges. These are all the extremities. So sac group. I middle click and drag here, and I parent constrain them so that next time that I enable this, there we go. Okay, I think we've addressed all the problem cases. So now we can go right into art directing the frayed edges style. Before art directing the frayed edges style, we should save, of course. The art direction of the frayed edges style is very similar to the watercolor style. So you have your global parameters, your paint effects, noise effects, proxies, everything's the same, right? It's just a bunch of attributes that change. So The first one is the inflation, frequency, amplitude. So all of these need to be set properly. The default value for inflation rarely needs to be changed. However, the frequency and the amplitude do need to, depending on the effect that you want. So right now we have a lot of frayed edges, so we might want to reduce this a little bit. 0.7. Now keep in mind that the amplitude of the frayed edges can also be art directed. So in case you wanted to have a different amplitude on certain parts and than others, you can art direct this with a frayed edge amplitude paint effects. So I want to also talk about the frequency. The frequency works well when the size of the frayness, so to speak, is bigger than 1 pixel. So what do I mean by that? Let me show it to you guys. When I open the pass inspector and I visualize the inflated noise target. So if I go low with the frequency, of course, there's no problem. You're gonna see this in the output. You just have a very choppy kind of frayness, more like a wobbliness instead of frayed edges or broken edges. So it's no problem when we go down with the frequency. It's a problem when we go too high up with the frequency. And what happens is that once the frequency is too high, at some point it's gonna become smaller than a pixel. This can present some sort of jittering sometimes, because if you have many values inside a pixel, the pixel value doesn't really know which one to take necessarily every frame. So this can bring some sort of noise to appear again. So keep that in mind. Using TAA can help. So if we go back here and we enable temporal anti-aliasing, can help, but it won't solve all your problems, right? So just keep in mind that the frequency should never create noise that is smaller than a pixel. Otherwise, you might have some jittering there, in case you're wondering why this is happening. So we find 50 works, 100 works, even 150 might work quite well depending on your scene. So it's a matter of finding the balance there. So with that being said, I'm going to add a few things here. So first, I want to highlight the edges. So we go here and we go into edge darkening intensity. We're gonna move that up. But we have the edge darkening intensity from watercolor, and for frayed edges we want to emphasize a little bit, have more of an outline than a darkened edge. So we're gonna reduce the edge darkening width to something very small. And as you can see now, you can see that there's like a small outline, very defined, of course with the frayness on it, but it makes the drawn look really stand out in this case. Now, this is the first thing that I wanted to address. The other one is we have some joints here that I don't want to see. So I'm just disabling this. And then I want to use some NoiseFX to really add some fluctuations to certain effects. So I'm going to open the NoiseFX, and I'm going to first of all have some pigment turbulence. Increasing the frequency. Oh, by the way, we still have TAA enabled. Whenever you have TAA, everything is averaged, so you won't really see what you're stylizing or what you're art directing. So to art direct, keep things in standard and only render in TAA then afterwards. So, and as you can see, we're only addressing the tram here. So let's move the scale a little bit down. There's like a weird mixture between the tram and also the main building. So I think what I'll have to do here is I'm gonna separate them into two different materials to solve this. So I'm going to remove the pigment turbulence, and I'm going to pick this object. I'm going to open the material presets, and then I'm gonna create a new textured material for it. I'll go here, I select the atlas. There we go. And this should give us now a clear separation about the noise effects of the tram and the noise effects of the building. So once I enable that, I can define what sort of intensity I want on it. So I just want to add some subtle variation, right? Then I select the building again, I apply some noise effects, and now you can see we have a much more unified scale that was not mixing both of them at the same time. So I want something like this, but less accentuated. There we go. Something that I also want to add on this scene is some ambient occlusion. So I go here and set up ambient occlusion mode to be style specific, but I'm not seeing it here very much. So I'm gonna increase the strength, and here I can see, okay, this is how much the ambient occlusion is affecting the render, right? So I can have it like that and then reduce the amount. All right, so we have added some ambient occlusion. I want to also add some fluctuations to the outlines, right? The edges that we just added previously. So we can go here and enable this. And in case you want to see how the noise effects is affecting the render, you can enable that. And then you can see how big of a difference this is. Or if you don't like it, you can just remove it and then use paint effects instead. So for now, I think this is all right. Let me just check. We are in normal. We could add some gaps and overlaps, but I don't think for this case that would bring a lot of benefit. We have pigment turbulence. We can add some lighting to this. We haven't added any lighting so far, so I'm gonna go here, create lights, and I'm gonna create a directional light. Just making this a bit bigger so that we can see it. And we enable also shadows here. Now something really cool about Maya 2020 is that you can have shadow maps that are really big. So I can come here into the light shape, shadows, use depth shadow maps. I'm just gonna work with 4K, but you can really go up to 8K here without any issues, and the shadows look good. So we have this. I'm gonna modify a little bit the material attributes of this building. So I'm gonna go here. This is the, I'm just gonna rename this to main SFX, and I'm gonna increase the cambiante just to have more of this contrast between what's lit up and what's not lit up. Like this, looks nice. And I want to do the same thing with the tram here. By the way, the tram is moving and the noise effects is not. This is because we added a new material, but we didn't set it to deform, so we need to do this afterward. And now the noise effect stays with the tram as well as the frayed edges. So, okay, we need to add some cambiante to this. 0.6, even higher. Oops, I'm modifying the normal. No, actually this is the tram SFX. We just didn't rename it. Yeah, it's a tram. So I'm gonna add some very high cambiante, but something that I notice here is that the cambiante is actually on the back side of it. So for some reason, when this was modeled, probably there was some issues there. Easiest way to fix that is with flip back faces so that we get the normals the other way around, or rather the normals showing in both directions by the material, and then we can define this easier again. We can add some specularity and stuff like that. So we can really continue tweaking this until we are happy. And we can also add some canvas to it, just to add a little bit of this more handcrafted and put on paper kind of look. So for this, we can go into the configuration node and then select a canvas texture. We already have one, but we need to increase the roughness. And as you can see, this would be without the canvas. As you can see, the flat color looks very flat. So as soon as we add some roughness to this canvas, or canvas in general, you can start seeing that how this really changes the look of it as well. And then you can do different things with the canvas, right? You can have like a different canvas every few frames. You can also smoothly transition between these canvases to add some kind of aliveness to it. You can also advect this canvas, so it really depends on what you want to do. So that's it for frayed edges. I think this answers a lot of questions that you've been having about frayed edges, about using it in production as well. As you can see, it does require some extra setup and some considerations to get it to work, but once you have it, it really does a very nice job into breaking the edges and making them look 3D. So that's the whole point of this, faking something that looks as if it's painted, but it's actually 3D, and you can go inside of the streets and really create a painted world. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you want to follow us, please click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon to be notified about future videos, tips and tricks, and everything about MNPRX and achieving non-photorealistic graphics. If you love what we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It would be awesome to see you there, and it would mean a lot for us to continue developing this with your support. That's it. See you next time.